My heart is beating so fast. I've never been nervous to film a video before, but I'm so scared and have been putting this off for so long. Hey guys, it's Lizzie. So this is really happening, and I want everyone to know that I hated that this was happening. I fought so hard to get out of this intellectually. I did not want to be Catholic. Not only did I think Catholicism was wrong, I just didn't like the vibe of Catholicism. I wanted to be anything but Catholic. This isn't like I was dating a Catholic guy and we were in love, or I loved Mass, it vibed with me spiritually. No, I did not want to convert. I loved being Protestant. I grew up in a church called Church of Christ, and I was about to move to Thailand to be a missionary for that church for 3 to 5 years. I still miss Church of Christ. I still listen to Church of Christ hymns on my phone. I was doing that this morning during my devotional time. I literally am about to start crying thinking of how hard it was to have to tell my parents that I'm becoming Catholic. A lot of people have been pushing me to come out about this because people have suspected, and the reason I haven't wanted to is because my YouTube channel is public. Everyone in my personal life knows about it, and I don't want all these people from my college or from my churches growing up who poured into me spiritually to know this, because it comes across as betrayal. I did not want to convert, but I believe that it is true, meaning that it is the early church, the apostolic church, that it goes by the Bible more than any other type of Christianity. I think of truth as a dartboard, and I think all the types of churches are around this bullet point and are Christian and are so close to truth. But I think that the doctrines and dogmas of Catholicism are closest to truth. I think that my personality and me being American just makes it that I fit into Protestantism so much better. But I was willing to be wrong. I was willing to change. I was willing for truth to be something so uncomfortable, for truth to be something that I hated. I just wanted to find truth, whatever it was. So I researched myself into this since last February. I've just been obsessively reading and researching so much into what Christianity actually was in the early church. Like I said, I grew up in Church of Christ, which is part of the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. I learned growing up that Church of Christ goes by the Bible and is the early church. Those were the most important things, that we were being like the early church, that we were going by the Bible. But after researching into what the early church was actually like, I was shocked. It just looks Catholic. And I started reading Protestant scholars, atheist, agnostic scholars, no Catholic scholars. I was reading the Church Father writings, which do come across as really Catholic, but they're not something that Protestants would call Catholic sources. So I read primary documents from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. I'm gonna link right here a website and below where you can read the Church Father writings. Even from the Protestant and agnostic perspectives, the only tenable explanation of the development of Christianity in the early church is that the original church was the Catholic Orthodox Church in dogma. So many things were developments through the years, but there were a few basic things that were paramount, central to the early church that I only see today in the Catholic, Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox churches. And this is the reason I'm converting. The early church believed in something called the real presence view of communion, which a lot of people know as transubstantiation, which is the philosophical way that the Catholics have come to explain this. But the Orthodox and all of the Oriental Orthodox churches also believe in the real presence communion. So I'm going to go into my entire story from when I was in high school to now I'm 23, how I got to this point. But first, I'm just going to kind of give a rough theological outline of why I'm doing this. These are just some basic quotes from the church fathers talking about real presence communion. It's very obvious that the early church believed in the real presence view of communion. And the most important thing is that Jesus talked about the real presence view of communion. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, during the Last Supper, Jesus literally says, "Take, eat, this is my body, drink, this is my blood. So John is the last gospel to be written in around the year 90. And so there were so many heresies starting up in the early church almost as soon as Christianity began. And so within all of these heresies, John decides to be really explicit to make the real presence doctrine obvious. And so that's where the bread of life discourse comes in John 6. For me, once I started reading about the early church and just saw that so many church fathers believed in the real presence view of communion, after that point, I sat down and I read John 6, and this was the night before Easter of last year. And I remember I had just flown back from Virginia from visiting one of my friends. We'd gone to a Byzantine Catholic Good Friday service the night before, and I remember sitting on my bed in my bedroom and reading John 6. I'd actually read a comment on a video I just uploaded, and one of you guys, my subscribers, told me to read all of the communion Last Supper accounts. And when I read this, I started crying, like sobbing, because I saw the meaning for the first time. And it's crazy because I had just been reading through John, but it's interesting because the church you grow up in completely influences the way you read the Bible. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. At that, the Jews argued among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? They had the same reaction that I had my whole life, that so many Protestants have towards the real presence communion dogma. Even at the time, they thought it sounded crazy. So it's chill if you also think it sounds crazy. So Jesus said to them, I assure you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life in yourselves. Anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Because my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. The one, he just keeps going and going, yeah? The one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me and I in him. Therefore, when many of his disciples heard this, they said, this teaching is hard. Who can accept it? See, they have our same reaction. Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were complaining, asked them, does this offend you? Then what if you were to observe the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? And so he goes on, and then some people literally leave because they can't accept this doctrine of the real presence of the Eucharist. So this was the leading thing pulling me into continuing researching, continuing to read more and more about the early church. I believed in the real presence view of communion. Jesus teaches it. How could I go against that? And the Greek towards the end of Jesus saying 4 or 5 times, eat my flesh, drink my blood, is gnawing, chewing, like really graphic language to mean that he means it literally. The reason I'm choosing the Catholic Church over the Orthodox Church is because of Matthew 16, the papacy. We're gonna read that right now too, and I'm just gonna explain the exegesis of the way the Jews at the time would have understood it. And this has nothing to do with Peter being the rock. Obviously, I think Peter is the rock, but a lot of people debate that and it just becomes a crazy argument, so we don't even need that to prove my point about the papacy. Jesus said, Simon, son of Jonah, you are blessed because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the force of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth is already bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. So a subscriber sent me this like 2-hour lecture by this scholar. His name is Stephen K. Ray. This is his book, Upon This Rock, that goes into so much depth on the papacy. I'm gonna link below this lecture. Everyone can go watch it. It's just a couple hours. He's an amazing speaker, an amazing scholar. When Jesus says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, this wasn't a cute metaphor. So at the time, in the Jewish monarchy, there was a second in command position who was second to the king. This second in command dude literally wore the keys to the kingdom around his neck. I'm not kidding. And this is literally in the Bible. There's so many Bible passages about this in Isaiah, in 1 Samuel. But what's really important is to to understand that we're reading this from a 21st century perspective, so we're like, oh, sounds like a cute metaphor, but at the time, a Jewish first century audience, when they hear, I will give you the keys of the kingdom, that's Jesus telling Peter that he's the second in command position. It's political terminology. That's how the Jews at the time would have heard it. There are like 72 other arguments just as strong for why Peter was the Pope. I challenge everyone to read this book. Just read the book. You don't have to become Catholic. Just read the book and try to argue against it. This is why I'm becoming Catholic over Orthodox. A lot of people have been asking. And just the history of the Roman bishop in the early church. So what's crazy is that this second in command position, if the king ever left, this second in command dude was in charge of speaking for the king, like making decisions, saying things. He was in charge. He was the leader if the king was going away. And if the second in command guy with the keys to the kingdom, literally they'd walk around carrying like the giant keys on their shoulders, then that guy was replaced by another guy. So it's the coolest thing ever because Jesus goes away to heaven and the second in command position dude is in charge, and then when he dies, he hands on the keys to the kingdom of heaven to the next guy, etc. The other crazy thing, when I heard this, I was like, wow! So people don't like how Mary is a big deal in Catholicism. And to be honest, it's something that still makes me uncomfortable emotionally, just because my whole life I was taught that Catholics were worshiping Mary. So emotionally, it's something that's so difficult to get over. I accept all Catholic dogma, but it's just really hard. Anyway, so in the Jewish kingdom, guess who the queen was? It was the mom. Sorry, I'm yelling. It was the mom of the king. It wasn't the wife of the king. So Mary is the queen of heaven because she's Jesus' mom. We have to understand what the first century Jewish audience would have heard. So those are just the two basic reasons that I'm converting to become Catholic. Now I'm going to tell the whole story from the time I was 16 or 17 to 23 of how all of my thinking changed. Because this is a process that took years and years and years of gradually opening my mind, reading different books, taking different classes that made me realize that I can't accept the basic tenets of Protestantism.